Before we dive into today's story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Here we reveal the untold side of fame. The humid air of Lagos hit me like a wall as I stepped off the plane in February 1969. Even at night, the heat was stifling, mixed with diesel fumes and the earthy smell of a city that never slept. Pelé! Pelé! The chanting reached me before I saw the crowd. Hundreds pressed against barriers, faces lit by flickering torches. But what caught my attention weren't the cheering fans. It was the soldiers positioned every 20 meters, rifles visible, watching everything. A young man in a white shirt appeared at my side. "Mr. Pelé, I am Emeka, your interpreter. We should move quickly." Quickly. That word hung in the air as we walked through the crowd. People reached out to touch me, but carefully, glancing at the uniformed men who kept their distance but never looked away. The drive through Lagos was my first real taste of what I'd walked into. Military checkpoints every few kilometers. Sandbags stacked around government buildings. Armored vehicles parked on street corners. This wasn't the Africa I'd imagined from magazine photos. "How long has it been like this?" I asked Emeka as we stopped at another roadblock. 2 years since the eastern region declared independence. The federal government calls it a rebellion. The Biafrans call it survival. He showed papers to a soldier who barely looked 18. Both sides have been bleeding ever since. The hotel was decent, overlooking the lagoon where fishing boats drifted like shadows. But even from the third floor, I could hear the distant rumble of military vehicles moving through the night. Sleep came in fragments, broken by sirens and the occasional crack of something that might have been gunfire. The next morning brought a crowded press conference. Local journalists peppered me with the usual questions about goals and technique, but their real interest was obvious. One reporter, sweating in the cramped room, finally asked it directly. "Mr. Pelé, both armies have agreed to suspend operations for this exhibition. Are you concerned about your safety if the ceasefire breaks down?" I hadn't expected that question. "I trust in the arrangements that have been made," I said carefully. But sitting there, looking at those journalists' faces, I realized that everyone in that room understood something I was still learning. This wasn't just a football match. This was a gamble. The days leading up to the game were carefully orchestrated. Training sessions at local clubs, but always with security nearby. School visits that felt rushed, officials constantly checking their watches. Meetings with government ministers who spoke in diplomatic language about sport transcending division, but whose bodyguards never left their sides. "Is it always this tense?" I asked Emeka after a particularly awkward lunch with military commanders. "This is actually calm," he replied. "Last month, rebels tried to bomb the airport. The month before, government forces shelled a market in the east. People are tired, Mr. Pelé. Tired of the killing, tired of choosing sides. But tired doesn't mean safe." That evening, I tried calling Rosemary, but the international lines were down. Military communications take priority. The hotel clerk explained apologetically. Suddenly, Sao Paulo felt very far away. I found myself walking the hotel corridors at night, past rooms where other guests whispered in languages I didn't understand. The lobby television showed brief news updates, images of destroyed villages, columns of refugees, politicians making speeches that promised everything and nothing. Having second thoughts, Emeka found me there around midnight, 2 days before the match. Should I be? He considered this seriously. The stadium holds 60,000 people. Government supporters, rebel sympathizers, refugees, soldiers on leave, all sitting together for 90 minutes. In any other city, that would be remarkable. Here, it could be dangerous. Dangerous how? Someone throws a bottle. Someone shouts the wrong slogan. Someone recognizes an enemy in the crowd. He shrugged. Or maybe nothing happens. Maybe people watch football and go home. But you should know what you're walking into. I appreciated his honesty, even if it didn't help me sleep any better. The night before the match, rumors spread through the hotel that fighting had flared up near the eastern border. Nothing official, just whispers from staff who had family in the countryside. I watched Emeka take several hushed phone calls, his expression growing more serious each time. "The match is still on," he assured me. "Both sides confirmed the ceasefire will hold." But he hesitated. But, but ceasefires are easier to declare than to maintain, especially when young men with guns have been killing each other for 2 years. I stood at my window that final night, looking out at Lagos. The city sprawled endlessly into the darkness, punctuated by the occasional flare of military searchlights sweeping the harbor. Somewhere out there, government soldiers and Biafran rebels were cleaning their weapons and checking their ammunition, waiting for 5 p.m. when the ceasefire would officially end. The exhibition was scheduled for 2 p.m. 3 hours of peace in exchange for 90 minutes of football. It sounded simple when put that way, almost absurd. Could a game really be worth that much? I thought about the soldiers I'd seen at the checkpoints, most of them barely out of their teens, carrying weapons that looked heavier than they were. I thought about the journalists who asked about my safety instead of my tactics. I thought about Emeka's careful words, "Tired doesn't mean safe." Tomorrow, I would walk onto a pitch in the middle of a civil war, in front of 60,000 people who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The most famous footballer in the world, trapped between hope and violence, with nothing but a leather ball and 90 minutes to prove that some things were still worth believing in. But as I finally headed to bed, listening to the distant rumble of armored vehicles patrolling the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to learn just how fragile peace really was. The morning of the match arrived with gunfire. I woke to the sharp crack of automatic weapons somewhere in the distance, followed by the wail-off sirens. For a moment, lying in that hotel bed, I wondered if the ceasefire had already collapsed. Then Emeka knocked on my door, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Government patrol encountered some rebels near the airport road, he explained as I dressed quickly. Nothing serious, they said. Just a misunderstanding. Just a misunderstanding. With guns. The hotel dining room buzzed with nervous energy. Foreign journalists clustered around tables, speaking in hushed tones about incidents and security concerns. I tried to eat breakfast, but the eggs tasted like chalk. Every time someone entered the room, conversations stopped until people confirmed it was just another guest, another official, another person tried to pretend this was just another football match. Mr. Pelé? A young soldier appeared at my table, barely 20, still wearing his helmet despite being indoors. His English was careful, practiced. Would it be possible to get your signature? I looked at the scrap of paper he held out, part of a field ration wrapper. His hand shook slightly as I signed it. For my little brother, he explained. He's 8, lives with our grandmother in the north. He listens to your matches on the radio and tries to copy your moves in the dirt behind their house. What's his name? Chike. The soldier's face brightened. He says when the war is over, he'll play for Brazil like Pelé. After he left, Emeka watched me stir my cold coffee. His unit is supposed to maintain the ceasefire around the stadium today, he said quietly. Boys like him on both sides, trying not to shoot each other while 60,000 people watch football. The morning training session felt surreal. The local stadium where we practiced was surrounded by sandbags and military vehicles. Snipers were visible on the rooftops of nearby buildings. For security, officials assured everyone, though no one asked whose security they meant. I went through my usual warm-up routine, but every sound made me pause. A car backfiring became gunshot. A door slamming became an explosion. The ball felt heavier than normal, my touches less certain. You seem distracted, said Colonel Okoro, the military liaison assigned to the match. He was a tall man with tribal scars on his cheeks and eyes that missed nothing. Just thinking about the game. The game. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yes, the game. 60,000 people in one place, many of them with very strong opinions about this war. Quite a risk, don't you think? Is that a warning? An observation. Football brings out passion in people. Sometimes passion becomes something else. During lunch, rumors circulated like wildfire. A government minister's son had been killed in fighting near the Eastern Front. Biafran Radio was encouraging supporters to send a message at the stadium. Federal troops had been moved closer to Lagos overnight. How much of this is true? I asked Emeka. Does it matter? People believe it's true. Fear is just as dangerous as facts. The afternoon brought a final meeting with match officials. The mood in the conference room was tense, everyone speaking in euphemisms. Security protocols, contingency measures, crowd management strategies. What they really meant was, what happens when this all goes wrong? The ceasefire holds until 5 p.m., Colonel Okoro explained, pointing at a map of the city. Federal forces maintain positions here, here, and here. Biafran representatives have confirmed their fighters will remain in designated zones. But, he paused meaningfully. But, prompted the FIFA representative who'd flown in from Europe. But wars have their own momentum. Young men with guns don't always follow orders, especially when emotions run high. After the meeting, I found myself walking the hotel corridors again, past rooms where other team members tried to nap or read magazines. But every door I passed seemed to hide whispered conversations about escape routes and emergency procedures. A maid cleaning rooms caught my attention. She was humming something, a lullaby, maybe, or opera. When she saw me watching, she stopped abruptly, as if music itself had become dangerous. "Sorry, sir. I don't disturb you." "No, please. It was beautiful." "What was it?" She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Old song my grandmother taught me. About children playing in a garden before the rains come." She looked away. "Before everything changes." That evening, the international phone lines were working again. I managed to reach Rosemary, but our conversation felt stilted, artificial. How could I explain the tension in the air? The way conversations stopped when strangers entered rooms, the constant presence of armed men who watched everything with tired, dangerous eyes. "Are you safe?" she asked. "I think so. The match is tomorrow afternoon. Then I fly home. Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise." But even saying it, I wondered what careful meant in a place where 18-year-old soldiers asked for autographs while keeping their weapons loaded. The hotel bar was crowded that night with journalists, officials, and hangers-on who spoke too loudly and drank too much. I avoided it, preferring to sit by my window and watch Lagos prepare for tomorrow. The city looked deceptively normal. Traffic moving, lights flickering on as darkness fell, the distant sound off music from nightclubs and radios. But I could also see the unusual things. Military vehicles parked where they hadn't been before, extra guards at government buildings, the way people moved a little faster through the streets, as if everyone sensed that something was coming. Around midnight, Emeka found me still at the window. "Can't sleep, too much to think about." He joined me at the window, and we watched the city in companionable silence. Finally, he spoke. "When I was a boy, my father took me to see a football match in Lagos. Just a local game, nothing special. But during halftime, fighting broke out in the stands. Political arguments that turned violent. People running, police charging with clubs, children crying." He paused. My father grabbed me and we ran home. I still remember him saying, "Even football can't escape politics forever." Why are you telling me this? Because tomorrow, we're going to test whether he was right. After he left, I tried to sleep, but my mind kept circling back to that young soldier's story about his 8-year-old brother practicing football moves in the dirt, dreaming of playing for Brazil. Somewhere in this divided country, government soldiers and Biafran rebels were cleaning their weapons and checking their watches, counting down the hours until the ceasefire ended. In a few more hours, I would walk onto a pitch in front of 60,000 people who had been taught to hate each other. The exhibition match was supposed to begin at 2 p.m. 3 hours of peace in exchange for 90 minutes of football. But lying there in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of city holding its breath, I began to understand that some gambles were too big for any one person to control. Whether the match would bring people together or tear them apart was no longer up to me. That decision belonged to 60,000 strangers who would gather in a stadium tomorrow, each carrying their own anger, hope, fear, and desperation. All I could do was play football and pray that it would be enough. The last thing I heard before finally drifting off was the sound of helicopters circling the city, their rotors beating against the night like mechanical hearts, counting down to something that felt bigger than any game I'd ever played. The noise hit me like a physical force as our convoy approached the National Stadium. Even from half a mile away, I could hear them, 60,000 voices creating a sound that wasn't quite singing, wasn't quite shouting, but something wilder and more dangerous. The rumble vibrated through the car's metal frame and into my bones. Emeka, sitting beside me, had gone pale. "I've never heard anything like that," he said, having to raise his voice despite being inches away. Neither had I. In all my years playing in packed stadiums around the world, I'd never experienced sound with teeth, sound that felt predatory. This wasn't the joyful roar of a crowd anticipating entertainment. This was the growl of something barely contained. As we rounded the final corner, the stadium loomed before us like a concrete coliseum, and I could see what was making that sound. People everywhere, climbing fences, hanging from light poles, packed so tightly in the approaches that individual bodies disappeared into a writhing mass. But it wasn't chaos. It was two kinds of chaos, carefully segregated. On the north side, I could see the green and white of Nigeria's federal colors. Government supporters, many in military uniforms, waving flags and banners with slogans I couldn't read from this distance. On the south side, different colors, red, black, and green of the Biafran flag, mixed with homemade signs and what looked like traditional dress from the eastern regions. Between them, a line of riot police with shields and batons, creating a human barrier that looked desperately thin. "Jesus," breathed the FIFA official sitting across from me. "This looks like a battlefield." Colonel Okoro, riding in the lead vehicle, spoke into his radio in rapid Yoruba. I couldn't understand the words, but his tone was clear. This was not going according to plan. Our convoy slowed as we approached the stadium entrance. Faces pressed against the car windows, some smiling, some curious, some with expressions I couldn't read. Hands slapped against the glass. I heard my name being chanted, but in different languages, different rhythms, as if even my identity was being claimed by opposing sides. "Stay close to me," Emeka instructed as we prepared to leave the vehicles. "Don't stop for autographs, don't pose for pictures. We get inside fast." But fast was impossible. The moment I stepped out of the car, the crowd surged forward like water breaking through a dam. Bodies pressed against the police barricades, which bent but held. I could smell sweat, excitement, fear, and something else. The metallic scent of tension stretched to its breaking point. "Pelé. Pelé for Nigeria. Pelé. Biafra loves you." The competing chants started almost immediately, each side trying to claim me louder than the other. I kept my head down and moved quickly, but I couldn't avoid seeing the faces in the crowd. Children lifted in shoulders, their eyes wide with wonder. Women in colorful head wraps, smiling and reaching out. But also men with hard expressions, watching not me, but each other across the police lines. Inside the stadium, the sound was even more overwhelming. The architecture focused and amplified every voice, creating a wall of noise that made communication impossible except through gestures. I followed Emeka and the officials through concrete corridors that echoed with our footsteps and the muffled roar from outside. "Dressing rooms," Emeka shouted directly into my ear, pointing down a hallway. But as we walked, I caught glimpses through the tunnel openings of the crowd inside the stadium itself, and what I saw made my stomach tighten with unease. They weren't sitting. The entire stadium was on its feet, and the careful segregation I'd seen outside had dissolved into something much more dangerous. Government supporters and Biafran sympathizers were mixed throughout the stands, creating pockets of rival colors scattered like sparks throughout the concrete bowl. I could see arguments already breaking out, people gesturing angrily, security personnel moving quickly toward trouble spots that seemed to multiply even as I watched. In the dressing room, the sound was mercifully muted, though still present like the rumble of distant thunder. I sat on the wooden bench and tried to collect myself, but my hands were shaking. Not from nerves about the match. I'd played in World Cup finals, in front of hostile crowds, under pressure that had seemed unbearable. But this felt different. This felt like sitting on top of a bomb. "How long until kickoff?" I asked Emeka. He checked his watch. 30 minutes. 30 minutes for that crowd to either come together or tear itself apart. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. Colonel Okoro entered, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. Fighting broke out in Section C between government supporters and some Biafran refugees. Nothing serious yet, but he gestured helplessly at the sound filtering through the walls. Are people hurt? Minor injuries. But it's spreading. Sections D and E are getting involved. We're moving more security in, but... He paused, choosing his words carefully. The crowd is not in a football mood, Mr. Pelé. They're in a war mood. Through the small window in the dressing room, I could see down to the pitch where groundskeepers were making final preparations. The grass looked perfect, peaceful, impossibly green in the afternoon sunlight. But around it, the stadium seethed like a living thing, 60,000 people balanced on the edge of something that could go either way. Maybe we should cancel, suggested the FIFA official, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool air in the tunnel. Cancel? Colonel Okoro laughed, but there was no humor in it. Until 60,000 angry people go home peacefully? That's not canceling a match, sir. That's starting a riot. Another knock, more urgent this time. A young lieutenant entered, saluted Colonel Okoro, and spoke rapidly in what sounded like Hausa. The colonel's face darkened with each word. What is it? Emeka asked. Shots fired outside the stadium. A government patrol and some Biafran sympathizers got into an altercation. No casualties, but he looked directly at me. The ceasefire is holding by a thread. I could feel the weight of decision settling on the room like dust. Everyone was looking at me now, not as a footballer, but as the person who would either defuse this situation or make it immeasurably worse. The warm-up? I said finally. I need to get out there for the warm-up. Mr. Pelé, Colonel Okoro, said carefully. Once you step onto that pitch, there's no predicting what happens. That crowd could explode in celebration, or he left the alternative unspoken. Then we find out. But even as I said it, lacing up my boots with fingers that still trembled slightly, I could hear the sound from the stands changing. The chants were becoming more organized, more militant. I caught fragments off what sounded like war songs, battle cries, the kinds of sounds that preceded violence rather than sport. Emeka helped me with my jersey, his hands as unsteady as mine. Remember, he said quietly, you're not just representing yourself out there. You're representing the possibility that this doesn't have to end in blood. The tunnel leading to the pitch stretched ahead of us like a throat leading towards something monstrous. The sound grew louder with each step. Not just noise anymore, but a living force that seemed to pull the air from my lungs. 60,000 people, government soldiers and rebel sympathizers, refugees and politicians, all crammed into a concrete bowl, all watching to see what would happen when a footballer from Brazil stepped onto a patch of grass in the middle of their war. At the mouth of the tunnel, I could see sunlight and green grass, and beyond that, a wall of faces that seemed to stretch up to the sky itself. The roar was so loud now that I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. Colonel Okoro grabbed my arm one last time. Mr. Pelé, he shouted over the noise. Once you step out there, we're all in God's hands. I nodded, took a deep breath that tasted of concrete dust and human sweat and the electric charge off impending violence, and stepped toward the light. The moment my foot hit the grass, the stadium erupted into something beyond sound, a wall of noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. I couldn't tell if it was cheering or screaming, celebration or riot, but as I walked toward the center of the pitch, feeling 60,000 pairs of eyes burning into me, I realized that in the next few minutes, we would all find out whether football could work miracles or whether some things were simply too broken for any game to fix. The whistle pierced the air, and suddenly, impossibly, the stadium fell silent. 60,000 people held their breath, as if someone had pressed pause on the world itself. The ball sat motionless in the center circle, waiting. I looked around at my teammates, a mix of Brazilian and Nigerian players assembled for this exhibition, and saw my own uncertainty reflected in their eyes. None of us had ever played in front of silence this heavy, this loaded with potential violence. Then someone in the crowd shouted something in Yoruba, and the spell broke. The noise that followed wasn't cheering. It was something rawer, more primal. Government supporters on one side, Biafran sympathizers on the other, each group trying to claim the match with their voices. But instead of merging into the usual stadium roar, the sounds remained separate, competing like two orchestras playing different songs. I touched the ball for the first time, a simple pass to my right, and both sides erupted, some cheering, some jeering, as if that single touch had chosen a winner in their war. My skin crawled with the realization that every move I made would be interpreted through the lens of conflict. The first 10 minutes were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Every tackle felt personal. When a government minister's son, playing for the opposing team, went down hard after a challenge, the northern section of the stadium howled for blood while the southern section cheered. Soldiers along the sidelines shifted their grip on their weapons. Officials whispered frantically into radios. I tried to play my usual game, quick touches, finding space, creating beauty from chaos, but my legs felt heavy, my mind clouded. The pressure wasn't coming from the opposition. It was radiating from the stands like heat from a furnace. These people weren't watching football. They were watching a symbolic war being played out on grass. Then, in the 15th minute, something shifted. A long ball came floating toward me from midfield. Time seemed to slow as I watched it arc against the brilliant blue Lagos sky. And for a moment, the crowd's noise faded to white static. I could feel 60,000 pairs of eyes tracking the ball's flight, could sense the collective intake of breath as they waited to see what I would do. I let the ball drop onto my chest, cushioned it perfectly, and as it fell toward my feet, I saw the space opening up before me. 3 defenders converged, but I was already moving, the ball seeming to stick to my boot as I glided past the first challenge, then the second. The crowd's noise changed, not louder but different. Unified, almost in a sharp intake of anticipation. The third defender came at me hard, cleats up, anger in his eyes. But I was already airborne, the ball lifting with me as I jumped over his tackle, landing in stride with the goal opening up before me like a green cathedral. The goalkeeper came off his line, arms spread, trying to narrow the angle. In that frozen moment, I could see everything. His diving body, the empty net beyond, the wall of faces rising up behind the goal. But most of all, I could feel the silence that had settled over the stadium again. 60,000 people holding their breath, waiting to see if this moment would bring them together or tear them apart. I struck the ball with the inside of my right foot, sending it curling around the goalkeeper's outstretched hands, spinning toward the far corner of the net. It seemed to take forever to cross those final yards, floating through the humid Lagos air like a prayer seeking an answer. The goalkeeper twisted desperately, fingertips brushing the ball, but unable to change its path. The net bulged, the ball settled into the corner, and for one heartbeat, the world was perfectly still. Then the stadium exploded. But this time, it was a single sound. Not competing chants or rival songs, but one enormous roar that seemed to lift the concrete roof and shake the earth itself. Government supporters and Biafran sympathizers, refugees and politicians, soldiers and civilians, all on their feet, all screaming the same wordless joy. I stood in the center of that maelstrom, arms raised more in wonder than celebration, watching as something impossible happened in the stands around me. People were embracing strangers. Children were waving flags of both sides. I saw a government soldier reach across the barrier to shake hands with a man wearing Biafran colors. The noise wasn't just sound anymore. It was a physical force that seemed to sweep through every corner off the stadium, washing away the careful segregation, the suspicious glances, the barely contained hostility. For those precious seconds, there was only joy, pure and uncomplicated. My teammates mobbed me, their faces bright with disbelief. But even as they pounded my back and shouted in my ear, I kept watching the crowd, mesmerized by what I was seeing. An old woman in traditional dress was crying as she hugged a young soldier. Rival fans were sharing drinks. Children were laughing, their voices cutting through the roar like silver bells. But what struck me most was the silence from the weapons. Along the sidelines and the stands, throughout the stadium, for the first time in days, I couldn't hear the metallic click of safety catches being checked, the rustle of ammunition belts, the whispered communications between security forces. The soldiers were cheering too, their rifles forgotten at their sides. The match continued, but something fundamental had changed. The tackles were still hard, the competition still fierce, but it felt like sport again instead of symbolic warfare. When the opposing team scored 20 minutes later, their celebration was met with grudging applause from sections that had been hostile before. When I set up another goal in the second half, the cheers came from every corner of the stadium. But it was in the 68th minute that I truly understood what was happening. I was chasing a loose ball near the sideline when I collided hard with a defender, both of us tumbling into a space between the pitch and the stands. As I lay on the grass, momentarily winded, I found myself looking directly into the crowd barely 10 feet away. A government soldier and a Biafran refugee were sitting next to each other, sharing a bottle of water and arguing good-naturedly about my performance. Behind them, children were playing with a makeshift ball, mimicking the moves they'd just seen. An elderly man with the bearing of a chief was explaining something animatedly to a young woman in military uniform, both of them smiling. They weren't watching a war anymore. They were watching football. As I got to my feet and returned to the game, I realized that the transformation I was witnessing wasn't truly about me, wasn't even about football in the abstract sense. It was about memory. These people remembering who they had been before the politics and the violence and the choosing of sides. They were remembering what it felt like to share joy instead of dividing it, to celebrate beauty instead of destroying it. The final whistle came too soon. As the sound died away, I expected the spell to break, expected the careful hostilities to reassert themselves. But instead, the crowd stayed on its feet, applauding not just the match, but something larger, the fact that for 90 minutes, they had proven that unity was still possible. I walked slowly around the pitch, shaking hands with players from both teams, waving to sections of the crowd that had been ready to riot just hours before. The sun was beginning to set over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, and in that light, the faces in the stands looked different, softer, more hopeful, as if they had remembered something important about themselves. As I finally headed toward the tunnel, I passed Colonel Okoro near the touchline. His uniform was rumpled, his usually stern expression replaced by something close to wonder. "Mr. Pelé," he said, having to shout to be heard over the continuing applause, "I have been a soldier for 20 years. I have seen what war does to people, how it changes them. But today," he gestured at the crowd, still cheering, still unified in their celebration. "Today I saw them change back." The tunnel felt cool and quiet after the heat and noise of the pitch. As I walked toward the dressing room, I could still hear them, 60,000 voices raised in something that sounded like song, like prayer, like the sound a nation might make when it remembers how to hope. But even in that moment of triumph, I knew how fragile it was. In a few hours, these same people would return to their neighborhoods, their checkpoints, their carefully divided lives. The war would still be there, waiting for them like a patient predator. Yet for 90 minutes, 90 precious, impossible minutes, they had shown that some things were stronger than politics, stronger than hatred, stronger than war itself. They had shown that beauty could still bring people together, that joy could still cross any divide, that hope could still triumph over fear. As I sat on the wooden bench in that quiet dressing room, my jersey soaked with sweat and my legs trembling with exhaustion, I realized I had witnessed something I would never fully understand but would never forget, the moment when 60,000 enemies chose to become human beings instead. The silence after the crowd dispersed felt like the morning after fever breaks. I stood at my hotel window in the early evening, watching Lagos settle back into its weary rhythm. The streets that had been empty hours before, cleared for security during the match, now filled again with the usual traffic of a city at war. Military vehicles resumed their patrols. Checkpoints that had been abandoned for 90 minutes sprouted fresh soldiers with fresh ammunition. The war was picking up exactly where it had left off, as if those moments of unity had been nothing more than a collective dream. But I could still hear echoes. In the distance, children were playing football in a dusty lot. their voices carrying on the humid air as they called out moves they'd seen that afternoon. "Like Pelé! Like Pelé!" they shouted, and the sound made something twist in my chest. Somewhere in those narrow streets, 60,000 people were returning Tater divided lives, but carrying something with them that hadn't been there that morning. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Emeka entered, looking older somehow than he had just hours before, as if the day had aged him in ways that time alone couldn't account for. "The airport road is clear," he said quietly. "Your flight leaves in the morning." I nodded, but neither of us moved toward packing or preparation. Instead, he joined me at the window, and we watched the city together in companionable silence. "Tell me honestly," I said finally, "did today change anything?" Emeka was quiet for a long moment, considering his words with the care of someone who had learned that truth was a luxury in wartime. "The fighting resumed an hour after the match ended," he said. "Radio reports are coming in from the Eastern Front. Young men who cheered together this afternoon are shooting at each other again tonight." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had known this would happen, had tried to prepare myself for it, but somehow I had hoped. "But," Emeka continued, his voice softer now, "my grandmother has a saying. When you show a man Hatsan fly, he never forgets the feeling, even when his feet are on the ground." He paused, watching a group of children chase their makeshift ball through the growing dusk. "Those people in the stadium today, they will remember. When they're angry, when they're afraid, when someone tells them their neighbor is their enemy, they'll remember what it felt like to cheer together. And maybe, just maybe, some of them will choose to remember instead of choosing to hate." That night, I called Rosemary again. The international lines were working better now, and her voice came through clear and strong. "How was the match?" she asked. I found myself struggling to find words for what I had witnessed. How could I explain the feeling of 60,000 people breathing as one? How could I describe the moment when enemies chose to become human beings, even if only temporarily? "I scored a goal," I said finally, which was both completely true and completely inadequate. "Just one." She was teasing, but I could hear the relief in her voice that I was safe, that it was over. "Just one. But I think it might have been the most important goal I've ever scored." Later, unable to sleep, I found myself walking the hotel corridors again. But instead of the tense whispers and worried faces I had encountered the night before, I found a different kind of quiet. The journalists were filing their stories, their voices animated as they tried to capture something that felt bigger than sports journalism. The officials were making their reports, but with less urgency, less fear. In the lobby, I discovered the young soldier who had asked for my autograph that morning. He was out of uniform now, wearing civilian clothes, but I recognized his face immediately. "Going home?" I asked. He nodded, then smiled. "My unit's rotation ended today. I get to see my little brother, tell him about the match." His eyes were bright with something I hadn't seen there before. Hope? Maybe, or just the simple joy of surviving another day. "What will you tell him?" "That Pelé played football, and, for a little while, nobody was shooting." He paused, then added that maybe wars don't have to last forever. The next morning dawned clear and bright, Lagos washing itself in golden sunlight that made even the military checkpoints look less ominous. As our convoy drove to the airport, I saw the city through different eyes than I had just 3 days before. The armed soldiers were still there, the sandbags and barricades, and all the ugly machinery of civil war. But I also saw the children still playing football in the streets, the vendors hawking newspapers with headlines about yesterday's match, the people who walked a little differently, as if they were carrying something precious and fragile that they didn't want to drop. At the airport, a small crowd had gathered despite the early hour. Not the desperate, hungry crowd of my arrival, but something gentler. Families who had brought their children to wave goodbye, officials who shook my hand with real warmth, journalists who asked questions about football instead of war. As I climbed the stairs to the plane, I turned back for one last look at Nigeria. The country was still divided, still bleeding, still caught in a conflict that would drag on for months more. But somewhere in Lagos, and maybe beyond, people were carrying the memory of 90 minutes when unity had been possible. Years later, long after the Nigerian Civil War ended, I would meet people who had been in that stadium. They would tell me stories I had never heard about the government soldier and the Biafran refugee who became friends that day, about the children who learned that enemies could cheer for the same goal, about the moment when their country remembered how to hope. They would tell me that the war resumed, yes, but that it felt different somehow after that afternoon. That when negotiators finally sat down to talk peace, some of them remembered what it felt like when 60,000 people chose unity over division. That when the fighting finally ended, the memory of that match became part of the story they told themselves about who they could be when they chose to be better. I never knew if that was true or if it was just the kind of myth that grows around moments like those, the way legends sprout from soil watered by hope. But I chose to believe it because sometimes belief is more powerful than facts. And sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our better angels are the only things that keep those angels alive. The plane lifted off from Lagos as the sun climbed higher into the African sky, and I watched the city shrink below me until it was just a smudge of concrete and hope on the edge of a vast continent. The war continued, as wars do, but somewhere down there, children were still playing football and dreaming off scoring goals that could stop the world from fighting. As we climbed through the clouds toward home, I realized that I was carrying something with me too. The memory of what it felt like when sport became more than entertainment, when a game became opera, when 90 minutes of football proved that even the deepest divisions could be bridged by something as simple and profound as shared joy. I had come to Nigeria as a footballer. I was leaving as something I was still learning to understand, a keeper of hope, a witness to the possibility that even in the darkest times, human beings could choose to see each other as more than enemies. For 90 minutes, the war stopped, and sometimes that is enough to change the world.